Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 10th, 2025. Let me begin with some breaking news. It's being reported that the U.S. Senate has just voted to end the government shutdown. This was the longest shutdown in history. I don't presume to know that there's a solution that's been voted on other than to figure out how to pour more money in and cut more spending. As we've been reporting for many, many years, these kinds of false solutions only worsen the problem. That until you get to the point of recognizing that it's the breakdown of the physical economic system, of the American system, that until you address that, you're not going to solve a budget problem. Printing more money or cutting spending doesn't do the job. And as the deficit is approaching $40 trillion, as the annual interest on the debt is over $1 trillion, you're just pushing down the road the possibility for a solution. So hopefully there can be some more that done to change this. But I'll be addressing that when I give you a report on what happened this last weekend. There was in Paris a conference that took up on a serious level the question of how do you move from a collapsing imperial system to a functioning, healthy physical economy. No, this did not take place in the Paris or French legislature, but it was a Schiller Institute conference under the headline, The Emancipation of Africa and the World Majority, a Challenge for Europe. Now, much of the problems in Europe are the attempt to place the blame for economic crisis on Russia and Putin, and secondarily on the flow of immigrants into Europe. These are, as usual, false conclusions. Putin had nothing to do with the high price of electricity facing European citizens and industry. That's totally self-inflicted by green policy and by the sanctions against Russia. So the idea that somehow the Russians or the immigrants are responsible is a typical evasion of understanding what the problem is. It's the breakdown of 500 years of a European colonial project, which depended on a transfer of wealth from the poorer countries of the South to the imperial countries in the North. And we've reached a point in history now where the Southern Hemisphere is no longer going to go along with this peacefully and submissively. Whether they can create an alternative that will defeat the establishment in the North, that's partly up to us. But the intention is there in the global South, just as the intention in the global North is to continue the looting policy of the last 500 plus years. So this is going to be an issue which will require your participation to shape an environment and a quality of discussion that will bring about solutions. And that's precisely what was on the agenda in Paris, where a combination of presentations from longtime LaRouche movement leaders and collaborators was combined with having young people who are now moving to establish a new youth movement to take up the great challenge of the future. And why Africa? Well, because Africa is a continent with a growing population, increasingly young population, and a wealth of resources that, if it's deployed properly, will allow the countries of Africa to have a China-style improvement of its economy, of overcoming poverty. And that's what the discussion process was. What is it going to take in terms of qualities of critical thinking to develop a leadership in Africa that is not as brain dead as the leadership in Europe? The establishment in Europe has a commitment to maintain the existing order, which includes wars and chaos. Now, peace depends on an actual plan, a strategic assessment. And the issue is peaceful cooperation for mutual benefit. Now, the delusion in Europe, as I said, it's blame Putin. Well, then they say Europe will have to prepare for war with Russia. Russia has no intention of going to war with Europe. Do the Europeans really think they're going to fight a war against Russia? Well, they're spending money for the defense sector, but it's highly unlikely that what's produced in the collapsing industrial centers of Great Britain, France, Germany, the Netherlands will be able to keep up with what's being produced in Russia, nor should it. There's no reason for war. What we have is a barrage of lies from the Western oligarchy that's created the conditions for war. Now, sane people reject war, but do they have the mental and emotional energy to come up with a plan as an alternative and to fight for that plan? And that's what the conference took up. On the idea of a plan, there's an incredible array of infrastructure projects that are now being implemented in Africa with help from China and Russia. What if the United States and Europe were to be involved in that, were to commit the resources, the brain power, the labor productivity in Europe to produce projects in conjunction with the Chinese and the Russians in countries in Africa that are rich in terms of population and raw materials? Instead of exploiting them, instead of just going in and taking out what they think is value, how about helping the African nations develop the value in their own economies for their own people? That's what sovereignty is about. And that's what the ultimate issue is. Now, in the meantime, what do we see from the global north? Billions for new nuclear weapons, millions of soldiers. Why not build power plants in Africa? Why not water projects? How about high-speed transportation infrastructure? How about a space program? Did you know that there are a number of African countries that are training youth to become space scientists and possibly astronauts? So we see this potential, this desire for an improvement among sovereign states at rubbing up against the commitment of the European empire to keep them downtrodden and a source of exploitation of wealth. That's what the fight is all about. And that's why we see the situation in Gaza. That's why the Europeans won't stop in Ukraine even after Ukraine has been defeated. And then what you see is that a moment of truth is coming. Now, the New York City election had a little bit of an example of that. How did Mamdani win the election? There was a fascinating clip of the last mayor's debate where the 4 or 5 mainstream candidates were asked, what will be your first trip as mayor of New York? And all of them said, going to Israel, except Mamdani. And he answered, he said, I'm going to stay here and work with my constituents to improve the circumstances they have here in New York City. Now, why should that seem so radical? But it was, and it had a big impact on the voters. And a large portion of New York City's Jewish voters voted for a Muslim who was called a socialist and a radical, Mamdani. Why? Were they voting for an end to Israel? Were they anti-Semitic? No, they were reacting to what Netanyahu and the American government has done to collaborate in a genocide of the Palestinian population. And to say, no, we're not going to do that, is a radical departure. But it inspired people to go out and vote, even people who may be afraid that Mamdani is not up to the task. So this is the kind of revolutionary situation that we're facing. Now, I'm going to be linking the conference at the bottom of the description page, so you can watch and listen and participate yourself in the discussion process. It's highly fascinating. It's exciting. The involvement of youth in the discussion is especially important. And this now poses the question to you. You have to choose. Will you join with us in building this new youth movement? Or will you sit back and complain when you watch your tax dollars going into slaughtering children and destroying states? So you now have a choice. You can side with Tony Blair, you can side with the late Dick Cheney, with Nancy Pelosi, with King Charles, with Zelensky, or you can join the new world of the global South and make sure it's not just the global South, but that we in the North are a part of this revolution. And at the end of the conference, Helga Zepp-LaRouche called for a new international youth movement. That's something which I've been a part of in the past. LaRouche's first international youth movement in the 60s and 70s. The second one we built around the year 2000. Now it's time to do it again, only bigger, stronger, and better. So join us, watch the video, comment on it, pass it around, and let's see if we can make this the year of decision.